today I'm going to be talking really about the women's rights movement and how important it has been in our state and how it's really important today. Um, First of all, can I just ask you a few questions? How many of you voted in the last election? Great. And how many of you students voted for the astronaut or aviator booth? So please vote. It's good practice. How many of you went on the women's marches? Great. How many of you have written a letter to the editor about something? Wow, okay. How many of you have engaged in a protest that involved civil disobedience? Wow, what a wonderful activist crowd we have today. And the reason I'm asking, and I'm curious to know, is because all of these activities, from marching, from voting, from writing letters to the editor, from being involved in civil disobedience to going door to door, knocking on your neighbor's doors, all of these are important in securing our rights. So what I wanted to share with you today is, as Addie said, about the movement for women's suffrage in California. But I also wanted to take us back a little bit further about the women who fought for rights that affected not only voting rights, but all of our rights, about fighting against race segregation, fighting against sex discrimination at work, fighting for many of the rights that we kind of take for granted today, although maybe not so much today. Maybe they're coming into view again and we realize we have to pick up the banners again. But all of the women who worked for those rights in the past in California that maybe many of you have never heard of, which is another reason why I love the exhibit inside the History Museum of all the women who have names and histories and who have fought for our rights. Thank you for doing that exhibit as well. So, do any of you know when the first California Constitution was written and signed? Okay, it was 1849. Okay, 1849 in Monterey. And of course, all of the delegates were men, and most of those men, although they had other occupations before, were miners, because that was who was populating the state. So one of the things that happened in that Constitution, which is of note that a lot of people don't know, was that it was written in both English and Spanish. And all of the debates and all of the resolutions had to be in both English and Spanish. And at the top of the table where the debates were being held in Colton Hall in Monterey, there was a place of honor for the Spanish-English, English-Spanish dictionary. And I think that's really important for us to remember in these days when there's so many attacks on immigrants, especially immigrants from Central and Latin America, and when there is a pernicious English-only law in effect in this state, which was passed by 2/3 of the vote, that our very first Constitution was in English and Spanish. Another thing that was really important about that Constitution was that it gave certain rights to women that they did not have granted by the federal Constitution. So one was that they could own property in their own name. Another was that they could keep that property while they were married in their own name. And a third was that they could sue for divorce and keep their property after divorce. Now, this wasn't necessarily because these men were so enlightened about women. It was more because they were trying to attract women to come to California. Remember, most of them were minors, and the population was very, very skewed towards male. But they didn't want just any women. They wanted women with property to come. So, but because of that, some of those rights were enshrined, and that was really important. But of course, many women were left out of those rights, and those were primarily women of color, Native women, African American women, Latina women, and women who were literally imported from China. even though after slavery had been abolished, there were still women being sold on the docks in San Francisco whose families, because of famine and poverty and disease and war in China, had sent them to the United States thinking they were going to be working, and they were literally sold into the sex trade, into slavery. And there is a bill of sale that is very stark that I'll just read to you, which I think speaks to the conditions that those women faced. There's a bill of sale that says rice, 6 mats at $2 each, $12. Salt fish, 60 pounds, 10 cents a pound, $6. Girl, $250. And this is at a time when people were fighting against slavery in the Civil War, but there was still this kind of slavery going on in California. Well, there were many women who fought back, and from them we could take inspiration. One of those was one of my favorite women in San Francisco that's not written about in any textbooks, but we're trying to change that. Her name was Charlotte Brown. Have any of you heard of Charlotte Brown? Okay. In 1863, Charlotte Brown, who was an African-American woman, the daughter of a freed slave from Baltimore who had come out west with his family, was riding on a streetcar in San Francisco, the omnibus streetcar, from her home on Filbert Street to her doctor's appointment on Howard Street. And she was told by the streetcar conductor that she would have to get off because, quote, colored persons were not allowed to ride. Well, Charlotte Brown refused to get off that streetcar. Now remember, this was 1863, the Civil War was still raging, blacks could not vote in California or anywhere, had to attend segregated schools, could not even attend the public library. And Charlotte Brown fought back, and she refused to get off that streetcar. And the conductor told her every stop she had to get off, and finally she said, I am not getting off. He took her arm and forced her off the car. Well, Charlotte's father was very angry at this. He had come out of slavery. He had started a stable in San Francisco and started the first African-American newspaper in San Francisco called Mirror of the Times. And he said, we're going to court. So they actually sued the streetcar company. And the first judge ruled in Charlotte's favor because she had bought her ticket. But the ruling was so paltry that it made a mockery of the decision. He ordered her 5 cents, the streetcar fare. And it didn't stop the streetcar company from doing the same thing over and over again. So a few months later, when Charlotte and her father were forced off a streetcar, they sued again. And this time, they got an amazing judge, Judge Pratt, who ruled not only in her favor, but said in a very eloquent statement that too long the black man and woman have worn the yoke of the white man's oppression. And he ordered the streetcar company to pay $500. Now remember, this was before the 14th Amendment, before he had any federal law to stand on, but he, in his sense of justice, supported Charlotte's Brown claim. And a few years later, 20 years later, the state legislature in California actually outlawed race discrimination on public transportation. Another woman who fought back was a Chinese woman named Mamie Tape, whose family wanted to send her children to the local elementary school in San Francisco called Spring Valley, and she was refused and told that the girls, 8-year-old Mamie Tape, would have to go to the Oriental School, which didn't have as many books, it had not a very good facility, and it was very far from their home. Well, Mamie Tape, the mother, wrote a letter to the state school superintendent, and she published it in the paper, and it was a very powerfully written letter saying, why should my daughter be denied the right to go to school with other children to a good school? And she actually won her case at the California Supreme Court. But when she brought Mamie to school, they were told a new law had just been enacted. And that law was that if there was an Oriental school nearby, that the child would have to go to that school. And so they quickly set up an Oriental school near Spring Valley, and the Chinese children were forced to go to that school. And it was not until 1947 when California schools were desegregated in a school called Mendez versus California, which was on behalf of a Latino family in Riverside, California. And so that was, 50 years later. Now, all of these women who were so amazing lead me to talk about, again, another one of my most favorite women. This is Selena Solomons, a suffragist in California. Have any of you heard of Selena Solomons? Okay. Selena Solomons was a very different kind of suffragist. She was in a movement that was led mostly by society women and Christian women. Some of the organizations came out of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Selena Solomons was a Jew, and she was from a family that had fallen on hard times. So she was from a very well-educated, middle-class family. In fact, her sister became a psychologist, and her brother was the first cartographer of Yosemite. He actually walked with John Muir in Yosemite. But her father got addicted to absinthe, that very potent liqueur, and he left the family, and the mother had to support the family on her own. And so Selena, who was very scholarly, sadly had to drop out of school, and she tutored children in English and in piano. But she never gave up her dream of fighting for women's right to vote. So Selena Solomons felt that the suffrage movement was too dominated by society women and did not pay enough attention to working women. So what did she do? Have any of you been to Union Square in San Francisco, big shopping area? Okay, so just north of Union Square is Sutter Street. She opened at 315 Sutter Street the Votes for Women Club. And what she did was cooked and served lunch to the shop girls, laundresses, telephone operators, and waitresses who worked in Union Square. And she served an incredible menu. I think I have a note of what was on the menu. Yes, I was very excited doing research in the Bancroft Library to find the actual menu from the Votes for Women Club. I'm just going to read it to you. Tomato bisque soup, chicken, clam chowder, 5 kinds of salads served with mayonnaise or pure olive oil, French artichokes, fried sand dabs, and creamed codfish. And at the bottom of the menu, it says, "The girl who comes to eat, we hope will stay to organize for the vote." So Selena thought of everything, right? And when we found that menu, my co-author Stan Yogi and I were doing research in the Bancroft Library, and I just screamed, "Oh my gosh, 5 cents for creamed codfish." And she did attract a lot of women. And next to the dining room was the library, where she had it stocked with suffrage literature and pamphlets, and she put on cultural performances, and she organized the women to go out to walk precincts, knock on doors, to organize for the vote. How did she raise money? Well, partly a little bit from the serving the food, but she organized a men's auxiliary to raise money for the women's right to vote. And she even had a sit-in. So she went down to the registrar's office in San Francisco, and over the registrar's office was a huge banner that said, "Every citizen must vote." And she brought a contingent of the women with her, and he said, "What are you doing here?" This was in 1910, by the way. Okay. And she said, "We're here to vote." And he said, "Well, you're women, you can't vote." She said, "We're citizens, aren't we?" Yeah. And of course they were. And they refused to leave. So it may have been the first sit-in long before the free speech movement in Berkeley, in California. The women's movement here in Oakland actually had the first public street demonstration also for the right to vote. And that was at the 1908 Republican convention. They were asking for a platform for women's right to vote. So there were lots of activities going on, and one of the reasons we know about them is because Selena Solomons actually wrote a pamphlet called How We Won the Vote, the women's organizing for women's suffrage in California, which was published in 1911. And because of that, we know of all these different tactics, like the ones I was mentioning very early on in my talk, that they undertook way back in 1911. Okay, so October 10th, 1911 is the vote on the California ballot. And they organized precinct walkers, they went all over town, and they stayed up all night to watch the polls because they knew there might be trickery at the polls. And the next morning, the Chronicle and the Examiner both had headlines saying that suffrage had lost, because in Alameda County and San Francisco County, the vote went against suffrage. But the suffrage advocates said, wait a minute, we're waiting for the vote to come in from the rural counties and Los Angeles, which was pretty rural at the time actually as well. And there had been a lot of organizing done there. And when it came in, the tally of the vote was 3,500 votes in over for yes. It was just 2%, but it was enough to change the course of history. So I guess from that experience of the suffragists of 1911, we have learned a lot of lessons. They were the sixth, we were the sixth state to win the vote for women. We were called the Sixth Star. And the California women were tireless. And as Addie said, there's an incredible display inside on the national women's suffrage movement from 1912 on. And California women played a very big role in that too. They traveled across country, they spoke, they lobbied in the Congress. Elizabeth Kent, who was the wife of a congressman from Marin County, headed up the congressional team along with Alice Paul. She was arrested twice at the White House for chaining herself to the gates of the White House. President Wilson actually put Alice Paul in prison for treason because it was at the time of World War I, and he said that she was undermining the cause of the war effort. But Elizabeth Kent, because her husband was a member of Congress, she kind of pulled some strings and got out. But she was still, very, very much of an advocate. And since that time, of course, even though we've had the right to vote, we've had to fight for so many other causes, against sexual harassment at work, against sexual discrimination at work, against being limited in sports, in schools, in business. We've had to fight to have jobs, to be members of unions, to control our own bodies for reproductive rights, to have child care, to have marriage equality so that you can marry the person that you love, no matter what gender they are or you are. So we've had to continue fighting for women's rights, and I wanted just to share with you some of the women upon whose shoulders we stand today. And that is why, again, I am so grateful to see so many young people here today, because I know that you are our future and you will continue to fight for our rights. And you're showing that so much by being here at Women's Equality Day here at the San Leandro Museum. So I want to thank you for sharing these thoughts with me. I, I, I will be at the table that has my book. I'm happy to answer any questions. I think it's hot, so we don't have time for questions up here, but I'm happy to be there and talk to you. And again, thank you so much to Addie and Mary Beth and the San Leandro Museum, and to all of you for coming out today. Thank you.